What's up, everybody? Thanks as always for supporting the show. It would mean a lot to me if you would take a second to scroll down and hit that subscribe button to the Hoops Tonight YouTube channel, and then follow me on social media on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter so you guys don't miss any of our content over the course of this season. All right, let's talk some basketball. So one of the beautiful things about the game of basketball, something that I've always really appreciated, is when you have a bad day, you can typically turn around and fix it within a day or two. You know, whether it's, you're playing in college and you have a bad conference loss, there's usually not a lot of time to think about it because you got to turn around and play another conference game usually 2 or 3 days later, right? Or in the pros, or even if you just go down to the gym and you have a bad day playing pickup, you usually can turn around and go up the next day and make it feel better, right? Just by playing better and righting those wrongs, right? Well, the Warriors had a heartbreaking loss on Saturday night in Atlanta, where they wasted a 60-point Steph Curry performance, and they righted a lot of those wrongs in some specific areas. Crunch time execution, getting some support for Steph. A big one was just getting better and sharper on the defensive end of the floor. Actually, ironically, it was the bench that fueled this win against Brooklyn. There was a kind of a strange lineup there at the end of the third quarter that ended up springing the run, as Brandon Podziemski with Lester Quinones, Guy Santos, another big forward that we haven't seen much of this year, that kind of just provided that size and motor, which is so incredibly valuable in the NBA. Some solid point of attack defense as well. Jonathan Kuminga was the offensive fulcrum of that run, pushing out in transition, drawing fouls. He hit Kevon Looney on a cut to the basket when the Nets lost him. They straight ISO'd him against Mikal Bridges on the left block, and he just went to that little left shoulder fade that he's been hitting. Once again, all season long, we've been wondering whether or not Jonathan Kuminga would slow down as like a post-up kind of fulcrum weapon that they could go to, especially as just like a half-court option that isn't Steph Curry, and he just continues to be efficient. And we're going to get back to that when we start talking about crunch time. But like they ended up building a double-digit lead, going up by 10 points there in the early fourth quarter, and that just kind of changes the calculus of the way the end of the game is going to go. Because then when Steph comes back in, he's not in a situation where he's in a dogfight and he has to hit shot after shot after shot just to stay punch for punch with a Trae Young or punch for punch with a De'Aaron Fox or whoever it is that they're going up against. Instead, he's hitting stiff arm shots. He's hitting shots that are maintaining the lead and keeping that, distance. They're lower pressure. There's more margin for error. And that's the key, because margin for error has been one of the biggest issues for the Warriors this year. They can't afford to really get into super close games late because they've struggled so much, particularly getting stops and getting offensive support outside of Steph. And when you give yourself more margin for error, then when Royce O'Neal gets hot like he did there in that fourth quarter, he was the one guy for Brooklyn who really had it going. He's just a guy that can get really streaky hot from the three-point line, right? And when Royce O'Neal got hot and made a bunch of shots, he never was able to actually get the game to the point where it was in danger. It was all just kind of stuff that kept the game somewhat in reach, right? And so that margin for error made a big difference. So shout out to those guys. Again, Jonathan Kuminga leading the way with on the offensive end of the floor, and then everybody just playing really hard in that group. Specifically down the stretch, Guy Santos and Brandon Podziemski were super, super active on both ends of the floor, defensively, in help, especially on the offensive glass. Those guys had 5 offensive rebounds, some huge ones. Guy Santos just was constantly right around the front of the rim where he needed to be. Brandon Podziemski got a contested offensive rebound. I actually clipped this play and put it on my Twitter feed, where he was going up over a bunch of 6'8", 6'10" athletes and just rose up over everybody because he wanted the ball more and went to get it, right? Like, we talked a lot about this concept on the show, the difference between, talent and like discipline when it comes to a good defense, and both parts are equally important. There are personnel limitations. You're going to need Gary Payton back to be as good as you can be defensively, right? You're going to need Andrew Wiggins in the lineup to be as good as you can be defensively. But if you do all the right stuff, if you're in the right spots, if you're committed to the details, if the communication is there, your basketball character, as I always call it, if you can get there, that's half the battle. And particularly in matchups like this against the Nets, a team that don't have, they're struggling in their own ways, right? Like, Mikal Bridges is a number one option, has some limitations. Spencer Dinwiddie's had a bad season. He, once again, last night, driving into traffic and throwing up BS and missing shots and complaining to the refs while they're running out the other way. He's just had a rough year, right? And like, they got some young guards that Dennis Smith Jr. and Cam Thomas that can struggle with decision making and defense and stuff like that. So like in a group like that, if you do the right stuff, like if you just are in the right spots, you can go a long way towards causing their offense to have issues. And then when you play against the best teams in the league, that's where you need both. That's where you need the personnel strengths and the schematic strengths. But I thought last night was a big step forward just in terms of the commitment that the Warriors need to make to being a better defensive team. And then down the stretch, I really, really liked the versatility that Golden State went with in terms of their offensive approach. We talked a lot yesterday about the idea of like Steph Curry just kind of hunting his shot, and when it's working, it's great. But when that starts to, whether the defense starts throwing multiple bodies at him or whether it's, him just starting to cool off, like, jump shooting is a high variance thing, even for the best player in the world, right? Or the best shooter in the world, I should say, right? So like that's an important kind of like part of that process. And so adding a little bit more variety to their attack can go a long way to kind of maintaining their offensive success. And I really liked that they did run some pick and roll. There was a Draymond short roll that led to a Jonathan Kuminga dunk when Steph Curry drew a blitz, but they didn't overdo that. One of the things that becomes a problem that we've seen this season is teams just start to blitz Steph super, super aggressively, and the Warriors have struggled a little bit to work off of that. And we saw this a little bit in the Hawks game where Steph started just going straight ISO against DeJounte Murray. We saw a lot of that down the stretch. And then Draymond, instead of setting a ball screen, he'd sit in the lane and basically like box out the help defender, like screen the help defender just so that he can't step over and help on Steph. And then he ended up icing the game with a floater that was an and one, where beat a guy in straight ISO, then he was getting just kind of slowed down and waited for the back pressure to come, drew the foul, and made the little floater. But the big kind of thing that stood out to me was there was a big possession down the stretch of the game where the Nets because again, the Nets kind of kept it close with those Royce O'Neal threes, where Steph just straight up went to Jonathan Kuminga on the left block in a post up against Royce O'Neal, and he drew a foul. And I thought a couple of different things. One, like the trust that Steph was showing. And again, we talked about this. I actually was pitching this in yesterday's show, but before last night, Jonathan Kuminga was 7 for 13 in crunch time this season. That's over 50%. Again, this season, a post up for Jonathan Kuminga has been worth well over a point per possession. And it helps in a bunch of different ways. It's rest for Steph, but it's also just variety. It's a different thing for the defense to have to deal with. And so I really, really liked just the overall kind of variety that Golden State brought to the table down the stretch in crunch time. They've got a couple of tough games on the horizon here, so we're going to find out a lot about the Warriors in the next week and a half, but I thought last night was a big step in the right direction. You will not see Golden State on my top 5 trades list. They might end up making some type of deal, but Steve Kerr is right. The Warriors deadline basically amounts to guys coming back. I would put the Warriors deadline down to 3 things. You're getting CP3 back to stabilize your bench units. You're getting Gary Payton back to stabilize your perimeter defense. And then the rapid rise of Jonathan Kuminga is an influx of talent in his own way. He had another 28 points and 10 rebounds last night. We're now at a 10-game stretch of him averaging 25 points and 7 rebounds on 61% from the field, 54% from 3, and 80% from the line. He's getting to the line a half dozen times a game this year. The foul drawing thing has been something that's been consistent, and that's what he did on that big late post-up. He just went to that same left shoulder fade, but he could tell Royce was being physical with him, so he just elevated straight up and down and baited Royce into bringing too much contact to the table. He's starting to get a favorable whistle too in a lot of ways. The refs know that Jonathan Kuminga has these defenders out of position. But really, the only way you could truly substantially improve this roster is to trade Jonathan Kuminga, because he's the one guy who has the value that could bring back a truly, franchise-altering talent. But then you give up his substantial long-term potential, and that's just not worth it. And so at this point, you're better off with the rise of Jonathan Kuminga and some reinforcements from guys who are injured with trying to make a run at that point. And then you can make a call based on how Jonathan Kuminga looks as a number 2 option in this year's postseason, which I do believe the Warriors will get into that play-in tournament, at least have a chance to play 7 games against a really good team, so you can get a good read for how ready Jonathan Kuminga is to contribute in a championship context.